It began with a sound that wasn't supposed to matter. On a mild autumn morning, long before the zoo filled with school groups and camera phones, the air carried its usual mix of distant traffic, bird song, and the low hum of maintenance carts. Keepers moved through their routines on instinct, unlocking gates, hosing concrete, preparing breakfast trays. Nothing about the day hinted at disruption. Nothing suggested that something ordinary was about to tilt into the unforgettable. Then came this sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, just a hollow, rhythmic thud, wood against wood, echoing faintly from the far end of the primate section. At first, no one paid attention. Zoo are full of strange noses. Animals bang, scrape, throw, test their environment constantly. Most sounds fade into background noise, registered subconsciously and forgotten seconds later. But this one didn't stop. The rhythm returned again, steady this time. Thud, pause, thud, thud, pause, thud. One of the junior keepers slowed her steps. The pattern tugged at her attention in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't random. It wasn't frustration or boredom. It sounded intentional, almost measured. She stopped walking a few meters ahead. Another keeper turned, his head browsed, knitting slightly as the sound reached him too. Their eyes met for a brief moment, both thinking the same unspoken thought. Do you hear that? They followed the sound as they rounded the corner or the gorilla enclosure. The source revealed itself in pieces. First, the echo bouncing off concrete walls, then the pause between beats, oddly consistent. Finally, the figure at the center of it all. A gorilla sat alone near the edge of the enclosure. His massive frame relaxed, his posture unusually upright. In front of him lay an overturned plastic barrel, one of dozens used daily for enrichment. Normally, barrels were chewed, tossed, dragged, or abandoned within minutes. This one, however, had become something else entirely. The gorilla raised his hand and brought it down against the barrel surface. Thud. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to the sound linger in the air. His eyes weren't wild or playful. They were focused, curious, alert. Then he struck again. Thud, thud. The keepers froze. In decades of working with great apes, they had seen intelligence, emotion, and problem solving that rivaled young children. But this was different. This wasn't tool use. This wasn't mimicry. This looked like experimentation. The gorilla paused, fingers resting on the barrel around him. The enclosure was quiet. Other gorillas watched from a distance, some perched on logs, others leaning against the glass. None interfered, none vocalized. It was as if they understood instinctively that something was unfolding that required silence. The gorilla struck the barrel again, adjusting the angle this time. The sound changed, deeper, fuller. His lips tightened almost imperceptibly, a reaction so subtle it might have been imagined. Almost. The rhythm continued. The keepers exchanged uneasy glances. A strange tension settled in their chests. Not fear, not alarm, but anticipation, the kind that creeps in when something unexpected begins to make sense, and you realize you're re-witnessing the first seconds of a story you don't yet understand. One keeper reached instinctively for his radio, then stopped. Somehow calling for backup felt wrong. This didn't feel like a situation to interrupt. It felt like one to witness. Minutes passed. Visitors began to arrive, slowing as they noticed staff standing unusually still. Phones came out, then lowered again, as people sensed, without knowing why, that this Wasn't he a moment for distraction? That sound drew them in, pulling attention. Like gravity, the gorilla shifted closer to the barrel. His massive hands, capable of extraordinary force, moved with restraint. Each strike landed deliberately, never chaotic. He varied the tempo, paused, then resumed, testing cause and effect with quiet fascination. A child pressed her face against the glass, whispering to her mother, "Is he playing music?" The question hung in the air. No one answered because no one knew. Inside the enclosure, the gorilla stopped suddenly. Complete silence followed the abrupt absence of rhythm, almost jarring. He looked up, not at the keepers, not at the visitors, but at the other gorillas watching him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then one of the younger gorillas swayed slightly, shifting weight from foot to foot. It was subtle, almost accidental, but it was enough. The original gorilla struck the barrel once more, harder this time. The sound reverberated through the enclosure, bouncing off stone and glass. The younger gorilla swayed again, more noticeably now. Another gorilla shifted position. A low hum rose in the chest of the troop, not a vocalization, but a collective awareness. Something had changed. What began as an ordinary morning had slipped into uncharted territory. The keepers felt it in their bones. This wasn't training. This wasn't coincidence. This was the opening note of something larger, something that challenged assumptions humans had carried for generations about creativity, rhythm, and the invisible line between instinct and expression. No one could have predicted where it would lead, but standing there listening to that first deliberate beat echo through the enclosure, everyone knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning, and whatever came next would not be easily forgotten. By the second week, the keepers stopped calling it a coincidence. What had begun as a curious rhythm on an overturned barrel did not fade the way novelty usually did. It deepened, it evolved, and most unsettling of all, it became intentional. The gorilla and adult silverback the staff had known for years returned to the same spot every morning, always after feeding, always when the enclosure settled into its quiet midday lull. He did not rush. He did not perform. He approached the objects placed in his environment with the patience of someone listening inwardly rather than reacting outwardly. He was not copying anything he had seen. There were no drums in his past, no keepers tapping rhythms for him to imitate, no external cue to trigger the behavior. That was what troubled and humbled the humans watching him most. This wasn't mimicry, the familiar explanation used whenever animals did something uncomfortably close to human creativity. This was invention. He experimented with surfaces first: plastic barrels, hollow logs, metal feeding trays. Each produced a different sound, and he noticed you could see it in the way his head tilted. In the stillness that followed each strike, he wasn't waiting for approval. He was listening, testing how the world answered back when he touched it in a certain way. When a sound displeased him, he abandoned it without frustration. When it intrigued him, he returned to it again and again, altering the force, the angle, the rhythm. Sometimes he used one hand, sometimes both. Occasionally, he incorporated his chest or forearm, not aggressively, but experimentally, as though mapping resonance rather than releasing energy. The enclosure itself seemed to respond. Other gorillas stopped interrupting him. Juveniles usually wrestled noisily nearby, learned without being corrected. to keep their distance. Older females settled along the perimeter, eyes half-lidded, bodies relaxed as if soothed by something they did not need to understand to accept. The keepers felt it too. There was a heaviness in the air during those sessions, not oppressive, but reverent. Conversations dropped to whispers. Radios went silent. Even visitors who came expecting entertainment found themselves lowering, their voices unsure why. Loudness suddenly felt disrespectful. The gorilla was not demanding attention, he was commanding it. What unsettled the researchers most was the structure. Patterns emerged, sequences that repeated across days, not perfectly but recognizably. He would begin slow, testing the sound, then build toward a steady pulse before letting it dissolve back into silence. There was intention in the rise and fall, in the restraint. He knew when to stop. At restraint, change everything. Animals express, animals react, animals signal. But restraint, the choice not to act, the shaping of absence as much as presence, was something humans rarely attributed to non-human minds. Watching it unfold in real time forced an uncomfortable question to the surface. If this was not instinct, then what was it? The gorilla never looked at the audience while he played. That detail mattered. His gaze remained inward or fixed on the object before him. This wasn't performance, it wasn't seeking validation. It was something closer to communion between body, sound, and space. The humans watching felt like witnesses to a private act that happened to occur in public, and then the others began to respond. Not immediately, not dramatically. At first, it was subtle. An older female rocking gently in time, her movement slow and fluid. A juvenile tapping fingers against the ground, not loud enough to disrupt, but clearly aligned with the rhythm unfolding at the center of the enclosure. Their responses weren't taught. They weren't synchronized by command. They were drawn. There was no dominance display, no aggression, no assertion of hierarchy. The silverback did not threaten or posture to keep control. He simply continued, and the group oriented itself around him naturally, the way living things orient towards something that feels meaningful. Bonding took shape through sound. In moments of silence, the group stayed together longer than usual. Grooming sessions extended, conflicts de-escalated more quickly. The keepers noticed fewer stress behaviors, fewer anxious vocalizations. Something in the enclosure had shifted its emotional temperature, and no one could point to a concrete cause except the rhythm. When researchers reviewed the footage frame by frame, what struck them most was the gorilla's face. There was no frenzy there, no overstimulation. His expression was calm, absorbed, almost meditative. The muscles around his eyes softened during longer sequences, his breathing slowing to match the pace of his hands. This wasn't excitement, it was regulation, self-regulation. That realization hit one of the senior primatologists harder than expected. Humans often use music to soothe, to process grief, to organize emotion. When words fail, to see something similar emerging, not taught, not rewarded, not reinforced, challenged. Decades of comfortable assumptions. Perhaps rhythm did not belong to culture alone. Perhaps it belonged to being alive. The gorilla's role within the group subtly changed, not in dominance, but in gravity. Others gravitated toward him, even when he wasn't drumming, sitting near him during rest periods, mirroring his calm. Infants clung to their mothers, Within his proximity, there was safety there, not enforced but felt, and he allowed it. That too mattered. He did not isolate himself, as many alpha males do. He did not push others away. He shared space easily, generously. When another gorilla touched the barrel during one session, he paused, not in irritation, but in acknowledgement, then resumed, adjusting his rhythm to accommodate the intrusion. Creation, it seemed, had made him more connected, not less. The keepers began to understand something that defied their training manuals. This gorilla wasn't just producing sound, he was shaping experience for himself and for others. He was offering a center, a steady point around which the group could gather. Without tension, they stopped thinking of him as an animal doing something clever. They started thinking of him as a presence. Visitors often left change, though they struggled to articulate why. They spoke of feeling calmer, of losing track of time, of watching something that made them question where the boundary between human and animal truly lay. No one danced yet. That would come later. For now, the enclosure breathed together, gorillas and humans alike held in the quiet authority of a being who had not learned to drum, but had discovered how to listen, and in that listening, he had created something no one could unhear. It did not happen all at once. There was no moment when the troops suddenly transformed, no dramatic instant that could be pointed to and labeled as the beginning. Instead, the change moved the way weather does, quietly, patiently, altering the atmosphere before anyone realized. The sky had shifted. The rhythm had already taken root in the silverback, but now it began to travel. At first, it appeared in fragments, a low thump from the ground when a younger male dragged his knuckles in a repeated pattern, a soft sway in the torso of an older female as she sat near the shade, lined, her weight shifting left and right as though following something only she could hear. A juvenile tapping the hollow side of a feeding crate, not loudly, not disruptively, but with intent. None of them were copying the silverback directly. That was the strangest part. There was no mimicry, no rehearsed imitation. Each movement was different, shaped by different bodies, different temperaments, and yet beneath that surface the timing aligned. The pauses matched, the silences spoke to each other. The troop was not learning a rhythm, they were recognizing one. Keepers who had worked with gorillas for decades felt it instinctively before they could explain it. The enclosure felt cohesive in a way it never had before. Not calm or calm, had always been relative, but synchronized. The animals seemed to exist within the same internal tempo, responding to one another with fewer misunderstandings, fewer sudden escalations. When disputes arose, they resolved faster. A glare replaced a charge. A low vocalization replaced a scream. The energy at once spilled outward, now folded back in, contained and redistributed. Sound had become a language. During feeding times, the shift was undeniable. Normally, the presentation of food triggered competition. Nothing dangerous, but tense. Postures stiffened, eyes sharpened. Each gorilla tracked not only the food, but every other body in that space. Now something else happened. The silverback would begin tapping before the keepers even finished locking the gates, not loudly, just enough to establish presence, a steady and hurried pattern that filled the enclosure like a heartbeat. The troop responded without looking at him. Bodies relaxed, movement slowed. When the food arrived, there was still hierarchy, still order, but the edges were softer. The juveniles waited more often. The females shared space without constant negotiation. The silverback himself ate last, as though confident that nothing would be taken from him in his absence. For the first time, the keepers witnessed a feeding session without raised voices, human or gorilla. The rhythm did not dominate the troop. It didn't demand obedience or submission. It offered something else, orientation, a center that did not rely on force. What astonished the researchers was how quickly the youngest members responded. Infants, still clinging to their mothers, began to move in subtle ways when the sound emerged. Tiny fingers opened and closed in time. Heads rested more heavily against shoulders. Fussing quieted mothers noticed to adjusting their positions to keep their infants within the sound's reach. It wasn't training. No reinforcement followed. No treat rewarded the behavior. The sound itself was enough, and then came the movement. It began with a female who had always been difficult to read. She kept her distance from the others, tolerated proximity rather than welcoming it. During one afternoon session, as the silverback's rhythm deepened, she stood slowly and took 3 steps into the open space near him. The enclosure went still. She did not challenge him. She did not posture. She simply stood, listening. Her arms hung loose at her sides, her knees bent slightly, then straightened again and again, not in agitation, but in repetition. It was unmistakable. She was moving with the rhythm, not dancing in any human sense. No flourish, no display, just a body finding alignment with sound. Another followed, then another. Soon the space that had once been dominated by dominance, displays, and territorial awareness became something else entirely. A shared ground. Gorillas moved around one another without collision, without warning calls, adjusting their pace. Intuitively, the silverback did not stop. He did not speed up or slow down. To accommodate them, he remained constant, an anchor rather than a conductor. The rhythm held, and the troop arranged itself around it, naturally, as if they had always known how. For the keepers, watching it was deeply unsettling in the most beautiful way. They had spent years studying guerrilla social structures, hierarchies, alliances, conflicts. They understood power. They understood fear. They understood instinct. This was something else. This looked like collective regulation. The troop began resting together more often, choosing proximity instead of dispersal. Grooming chains extended longer than usual, 3 or 4 individuals linked without tension. Vocalization softened. Even play became less chaotic, more measured, as though the juveniles had learned an unspoken rule about balance. The rhythm had become part of the enclosure's emotional infrastructure. Visitors noticed, too, though few could articulate what they were seeing. They spoke of feeling oddly moved, of watching something that made them slow down without knowing why. Children pressed closer to the glass, not in excitement, but in quiet fascination. Adults stopped filming and simply watched. It felt wrong to interrupt. One afternoon, a sudden loud noise from a nearby maintenance area shattered the stillness. A metallic crash that echoed through the zoo. Normally, such a sound would have triggered alarm. Gorillas would vocalize, scatter display. Instead, the silverback struck the barrel once harder than usual. The sound cut through the chaos like a command, though it wasn't aggressive. The troop froze for a fraction of a second, then resettled. Mothers tightened their holds. Juveniles drew closer. Within moments, the enclosure returned to calm. The rhythm had become reassurance. That was when the keepers realized something fundamental had changed. This was no longer an isolated behavior. It was no longer about one gorilla and an object that made noise. It was about trust. The troop trusted the sound to guide them through uncertainty. They trusted the silverback not because he was the strongest, but because he was the steadiest, because he offered predictability in a world filled with variables. In the wild, such cohesion might be explained by survival, necessity, and captivity, where food was guaranteed and threats controlled. This level of emotional synchronization had no obvious evolutionary incentive, and yet it existed because perhaps survival is not only about avoiding death, perhaps it is also about finding ways to live together without tearing each other apart. As the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the enclosure, the rhythm slowed. One by one, the gorillas settled, bodies folding into rest. The silverback stopped at last, not abruptly, but naturally, letting the final vibration fade into silence. No one moved for several seconds. Then the troop dispersed, not hurriedly, not reluctantly, but peacefully. The sound was gone. The connection remained, and in that lingering stillness, the keepers understood they were witnessing something rare, a moment when an entire group of beings, human and gorilla, had been drawn into the same quiet understanding, not because they were taught, but because they were listening. Science arrived quietly, the way it always does, when something unexpected refuses to stay anecdotal. It did not arrive with wonder. It arrived with notebooks, recording devices, measured steps, and careful distance. Researchers stood behind the glass with neutral expressions, trained to observe without projecting meaning, without allowing emotion to color interpretation. They had seen videos, reads, heard keepers struggle to explain what was happening in the enclosure. A gorilla drumming, a troop synchronizing, reduced aggression, collective calm. On paper, none of it should have held. Rhythmic behavior in gorillas had been documented before, yes, but usually as displacement, activity, stress response, or imitation, triggered by repetitive human sounds. It was not supposed to organize a group. It was not supposed to stabilize social dynamics, and it was certainly not supposed to persist without reinforcement. Yet, here it was that Silverback resumed his rhythm as if the presence of observers meant nothing. That sound rolled through the enclosure, steady and unforced. Sensors recorded frequency, cameras tracked movement. Heart rate monitors attached to non-invasive wearable collars transmitted data in real time. The numbers began to tell a story science was not ready to hear. Cortisol levels dropped across the troop during rhythmic sessions, not dramatically, not suddenly, but consistently. Microaggressions, brief stares, false charges, dominance testing decreased. Affiliative behaviors increased, not just grooming, but proximity tolerance, something far harder to quantify and far more difficult to dismiss. The researchers adjusted their hypothesis. Perhaps this was a learned association. Perhaps the sound had become a cue for feeding or rest or human presence. Perhaps it was coincidence layered on confirmation bias. So they removed the variables. The rhythm continued without food, without people, without predictable schedules. Sometimes it happened in the early morning, sometimes near dusk, sometimes after minor disturbances, sometimes for no visible reason at all. The silverback was not responding to the environment, He was responding to something internal, and the troop was responding to him. That was when the questions changed. Not what behavior is this, but what function does it serve? The difficulty was that the function did not fit neatly into any existing category. It wasn't T-play. It wasn't T-dominance. It wasn't T-mating display. It wasn't T-stress relief in the traditional sense. It looked uncomfortably like emotional regulation, the kind that humans associate with music. That idea made scientists uneasy. Music implies aesthetic experience. It implies feeling. For the sake of feeling, it implies something beyond survival, beyond instinct. For decades, researchers had been cautious, rightly so, about attributing such internal states to non-human animals, and yet the data refused to cooperate with caution. E.g., readings showed synchronized neural patterns during rhythmic sessions, not only in the silverback, but in multiple members of the troop. Brain regions associated with anticipation and reward activated together, not identically, never identically, but harmoniously. It was not learned mimicry. It was shared attunement. The heart recognized it before the mind allowed it. Keepers had known something was different long before the instruments arrived. They felt it in their bodies when they entered the enclosure as perimeter, a sense of ease, a lowering of vigilance. The animals watched them, but without that sharp edge of assessment. One keeper who had worked with gorillas for 25 years said quietly during an interview, "It feels like they trust the space now." Trust the space. No data set could capture that phrase properly, and yet it described everything. Science demanded distance. The heart did not. One afternoon, a juvenile slipped while climbing and cried out, not in panic, but in surprise. Before the mother could reach him, the rhythm started softer, this time slower. The juvenile quieted almost instantly, climbing back towards safety without further distress. No reward followed, no correction, only sound. The researchers watched in silence. That moment did not prove causation. Science does not move that way, but it carved a doubt deep enough to matter. What if rhythm was not merely stimulation? What if it was communication, not message-based, but state-based, a way of saying, you are here, you are safe, we are together. Humans had used rhythm that way for thousands of years. Drums and rituals, songs to soothe infants, communal music to bind groups under stress. It had always been framed as culture. But what if it was biology first? The silverback did not know he was teaching. He did not know he was leading an experiment. He was not aware of hypotheses or citations. He was simply doing what felt right. That realization unsettled the research team more than any anomaly in the data, because if this behavior was not learned from humans, not conditioned by captivity, not triggered by stress, then it meant something profound, that gorillas might carry within them the same ancient sensitivity to rhythm that humans do, not as entertainment, as connection. The final report would avoid poetic language. It would speak of nonverbal synchronization, effective alignment, group-level modulation. It would hedge its conclusions carefully. But between the lines, something else lived, a recognition that science had not expected but could no longer ignore, that emotion is not a human invention. That meaning does not require words, that sometimes understanding arrives not through explanation but through presence. The researchers left, eventually taking their data with them. The cameras were dismantled, the monitors removed, the enclosure returned to its familiar routines. Nothing changed. The rhythm continued. Visitors still paused longer than usual. Children still swayed without realizing why. Keepers still found themselves breathing more slowly near the glass, and in the center of it all, the silverback sat, grounded and unremarkable in his certainty. He did not perform for science. He did not care whether anyone understood. He simply listened to his body, to his truth, to something older than theory. Science would spend years catching up, refining language, publishing papers that inched closer to the truth without fully touching it. But the heart had already recognized what mattered, that intelligence is not only measured by problem solving, that creativity is not exclusive to humans, and that sometimes when the world feels fragmented and loud, the most powerful thing a being can do is strike a steady rhythm and invite others to find themselves within it. It did not happen all at once. There was no announcement, no viral moment planned by marketing teams, no countdown to wonder. The world did not decide to dance back on a specific day. It happened the way most real shifts happen, quietly at first, almost unnoticed, until suddenly it was everywhere. It began with a sound. Someone uploaded a short clip filmed on a phone, held a little too steady for someone who wasn't holding their breath. The silverback sat in the center of the enclosure, his massive hands rising and falling against the hollow tree trunk. The rhythm was unmistakable, calm, intentional, not frantic, not playful, grounded. In the background, other gorillas moved. One swayed, another tapped the ground. A juvenile bounced in uneven time, then laughed in that breathy way only gorillas do. The clip ended without explanation, no narration, no music added, just the sound. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. Within days, millions. People argued at first because people always do. Some said it was coincidence. Others said it was training. A few insisted it was fake. That most people didn't comment at all. They watched, and something in them responded before logic had a chance to interrupt. They felt it. Comments began to shift. I don't know why this made me cry. This feels peaceful. I played this for my kid and he started moving without realizing it. Teachers played it in classrooms. Therapists showed it to patients. A nurse in an emergency ward said she put it on during a night shift, low volume, and noticed how the room changed. People didn't talk about gorillas at first, but they talked about themselves, about how tired they were, about how loud the world had become, about how rare it felt to witness something that wasn't asking for attention, money, outrage, or allegiance. The rhythm didn't demand anything, it invited. Someone stitched the video with clips of people responding, children drumming on tables, elderly couples swaying in kitchens, strangers tapping feet on subway platforms, not performing, not copying, just moving. The internet, for once, didn't sharpen into cruelty, it softened. The zoo received letters instead of threats, handwritten ones, emails written slowly, carefully, messages from people who said they hadn't felt calm in years, from parents whose children with sensory sensitivities found comfort in the sound, from musicians who admitted quietly that they had forgotten why rhythm mattered in the first place. The keepers noticed changes too. Visitors lingered longer but spoke less. The usual restlessness, phones up, voices raised, impatience gave way to something closer to reverence. People sat on benches and stayed. Some closed their eyes. No signs asked for silence. It simply happened. The silverback did not react to the attention. He did not perform more often. He did not alter his rhythm. If anything, it became more restrained, as if the noise of the outside world passed over him without friction. What changed was everything around him. Other zoos reached out, curious but cautious. Researchers shared data, debated language, argued over implications. None of that reached the enclosure. What reached it were people. One afternoon, a man stood near the glass, shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed red. He was not filming. He was not moving. He stayed for nearly an hour. When he finally turned to leave, he rested his palm against the barrier and whispered, "Thank you." No one asked him why. A week later, a small group gathered outside the zoo gates, not protesters, not activists, just people. Someone brought a hand drum. Another brought nothing but their hands. They stood in a loose circle and waited. They didn't try to replicate the rhythm. They listened for it. When they began, it was imperfect, human, uneven. Someone laughed, embarrassed, and stopped. Someone else picked it back up. Slowly, a shared pulse emerged. Not identical, but aligned. Passers-by stopped. Cars slowed for a few minutes. No one was selling anything. No one was demanding attention. No one was right or wrong. They were simply together. Videos of that moment spread too, not because they were spectacular, but because they were recognizable. People didn't see performance, they saw permission. The world had been told in 1,000 ways. Too hardened, too optimized, to compete, too shot to be heard. And here was a creature who did none of that. A being who struck a rhythm not to dominate, not to entertain, not to explain, but to regulate, to connect, to hold space. The world responded because it remembered. Not intellectually, viscerally, long before language, long before borders, long before names. Rhythm was how bodies learned they were not alone. The silverback never knew the reach of what he had started. He never saw the headlines or the comments or the think pieces trying to explain why it mattered. He only knew the feeling in his chest when his hands met the wood, the subtle shifts in the air when others joined without being asked, the quiet that followed. Not emptiness, but fullness. That was enough. And maybe that was the lesson the world had been waiting for without knowing it, that not everything meaningful announces itself, that connection does not require permission, and that sometimes when the noise becomes unbearable, the most radical thing a living being can do is offer a steady beat and trust that someone somewhere will recognize it and answer back. What this story ultimately leaves us with is not just amazement, but reflection. At first glance, it seems like a simple, even joyful event. A gorilla discovering rhythm, other gorillas responding, and the world smiling along. But beneath that surface is something far deeper, something profoundly human, even though it did not begin with a human at all. This story reminds us that intelligence is not limited to language, and creativity is not owned by our species alone. The gorilla did not imitate for attention, nor did he perform for reward. He listened, he felt, he responded, and in doing so, he revealed a truth we often forget in our noisy, distracted lives. Connection does not require words, it requires presence. One of the most powerful lessons here is that influence does not always come from force or authority. The gorilla did not command the troop to move. He did not dominate or instruct. He simply expressed something authentic from within himself. And that authenticity spread naturally. Others joined not because they were told to, but because they felt invited. This is a reminder for all of us that strongest leadership often comes from sincerity, not control the reaction of. The other gorillas teaches us about emotional contagion, the way feelings ripple through groups. Calm creates calm, joy creates joy. Rhythm creates unity, and a world where negativity spreads faster than understanding. This story shows that positive energy can be just as contagious when it is genuine. It challenges us to ask, what kind of emotional rhythm are we contributing to the spaces we inhabit? There is also an important lesson about curiosity. The gorilla did not fear the unfamiliar sound. He explored it. He experimented. He stayed with it long enough to turn noise into meaning. How often do we dismiss new experiences because they don't fit what we already know? Growth, this story suggests, begins when we stay curious rather than defensive. For the humans watching, keepers, visitors, and millions online, the moment became a mirror. People didn't just see animals dancing, they saw permission to feel again, permission to smile without irony, permission to move without judgment, permission to reconnect with something simple and grounding in a world that often feels overwhelming. That is why this story resonated so widely. It didn't entertain us, it reminded us of ourselves. Perhaps the most inspiring message of all is this: joy does not need to be complicated to be meaningful. A hollow log, a steady beat, a shared moment that was enough to transform an enclosure, a troop, and eventually a global audience. In our own lives, we often chase happiness in grand gestures and distant goals, forgetting that small, sincere moments carry immense power. This story invites us to slow down, to listen more closely to others, to ourselves, to the rhythms around us. It encourages us to create rather than consume, to connect rather than compete, and to remember that wonder is not something we outgrow, it is something we neglect. And if a single rhythm born in silence and curiosity can ripple outward and bring joy to so many, imagine what kindness, patience, and empathy practiced daily could do in our own communities. If this story moved you, made you smile, or reminded you of something you'd forgotten, you exactly the kind of person this channel is for. By subscribing, you help keep these stories alive, stories that inspire, heal, and reconnect us with the beauty of life, animals, and the quiet moments that change everything. Subscribe to support the channel and join us as we continue sharing meaningful stories that touch the heart, awaken curiosity, and remind us that sometimes the most powerful messages come without words.